Welcome to the Dr. Bubbs Performance Podcast, giving you the latest evidence.
T4. Enjoy. Igor, thanks so much for carving out some time today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Terrific. Well, Igor, can you kick off our conversation here today by telling listeners a little more about your background and how you got into your work as a behavioral scientist?
Well, I grew up in different parts of the world, and I guess I first moved from the former Soviet Union, from Ukraine to Germany. And then I was wondering, why do people behave differently than I do, and why do they care about other things than I do? And so sort of that motivated me, I guess, from a very early age to start thinking about the human minds. I kind of always had that inclination, I guess, even back in Ukraine, but that became sort of more salient in Germany. And then I moved to the US, and then I moved to Canada. So now I study people's behaviors and their minds. And part of it is just driven by my history and part just by natural curiosity.
I mean, it's a fascinating topic and seemingly very topical at the moment with social media and how we communicate today, and the various different things happening in the world on sort of a geopolitical level as well, and the way the conversations flow on that side of things. But before we discuss any of that, can you start by telling listeners, your work around social class and wise reasoning and interpersonal conflicts? Obviously, very fascinating. Can we maybe start with what is intelligence, and how is that typically measured?
Typically, intelligence is construed, or like people think about it as some kind of general mental ability, sort of the raw force that helps you to think through difficult situations. The problem is that the way it's actually measured is not quite capturing that. So what's normally measured is your verbal ability, how well are you able to articulate yourself, how many words do you know, how quick are you at capturing, and efficient are you at capturing different patterns in the environments. We're presented with sort of little tests in which you have to identify a missing piece, like one of those puzzles that some of you probably know. Mm-hmm. And those type of abilities, they have historical reasons. The reason why researchers started looking at them is that intelligence research emerged in the context of testing school abilities, first in France and then in North America, and then to identify actually people from, to some extent, covertly, people of low class, blue collar, and people who have high education. And sort of some of the earlier proponents of intelligence research in the United States and Canada have been pretty much on the mission of social engineering, and they were writing about how we probably should just get rid of the undesirable, less intelligent populations, and less intelligence, like those who cannot verbalize themselves as eloquently or who don't have this type of analytical force of identifying patterns on some abstract tasks. So there's very much focus on this abstraction, very much focus on your ability to, if you read New York Times, the Globe and Mail in Canada, or the Guardian on a regular basis, you'll be scoring high on those intelligence tests. But that doesn't really capture the full gist of what the construct in general is about, which is often referred to as some kind of a raw ability to process information in an efficient and superior and efficient way.
And Igor, what's not captured when we talk about these standard measures of intelligence?
Well, quite often these measures focus on, as I said, like the ability to process information very fast, very efficient. But they also, a priori, try to make you think abstractly. And sort of the focus on this type of abstract thinking is obviously very important, that we cannot get away without it. And in school, we are taught to do that. And as a consequence of that, schooling tends to improve your intelligence over time. in some circumstances. But what is not captured is the other feature of what we need in everyday life. So quite often, we don't have to think abstractly, but we have to be very concrete about the situation at hand. Or there may not be a clear-cut solution to the problem. And we have to adjudicate. We have to sort of figure out what to do in this situation. We have to balance different things. And that is not captured in intelligence measures at all, because if it is about abstract thinking, they automatically assume that there is a right or wrong solution. And in most situations in our everyday life, there is no right or wrong solution. I mean, there is probably a right solution how to ride a bike, but if you're in a conflict with somebody, and you have your position, the other person has their position, and you have to come to some kind of an agreement. No IQ test, a classic intelligence test, will be able to predict whether you will be able to better listen to other person or not. In fact, if anything, research has shown that under some circumstances, those people who are better on those intelligence tests actually perform worse on resolving interpersonal conflicts, because they can come up with all sorts of arguments to support their position. And these arguments may be still wrong, or because, if you're just smart, you can come up with all sorts of reasons why you're right. It doesn't make you right if you just come up with the arguments. Because if your point is to just defend yourself, the arguments may be just deceiving. But at the end, you also may be deceiving yourself, because there is this idea of confirmation bias. The more arguments you come up with, the more you believe that you're right. So ironically, the smart people may be more likely to be biased and to not work towards sort of solving interpersonal issues. And quite often we see that, very, very smart people make interpersonally very, very foolish decisions.
Yeah, it's really fascinating, and I want to dive into your research around intelligence versus wise reasoning. But maybe before we do, could you, perhaps loosely define wisdom? What is wisdom? I know it's maybe a bit of a loaded term and quite a big umbrella there, but could you give us a bit of a definition?
Well, wisdom quite often refers either to some kind of ability to make sense of the situation and make a sound decision with the notion of some kind of a good judgment. Other times, wisdom is associated with a sort of like being content and balanced about who one is, how to live one's life, like when you look back at yourself. So in my work, I focus on the former definition, so thinking more about how people make decisions and try to identify the sort of notion of good judgment and sound judgment in everyday life, especially in the context of this kind of ill-defined complex situations where there is no right or wrong solution. So that's maybe what distinguishes wisdom, or how in many societies when people talk about wisdom, they think about this kind of complex issues that don't have a clear-cut solution that can be solved by a simple algorithm.
And amongst that, in terms of wise reasoning in these interpersonal conflicts, what are some of the central aspects of wise reasoning?
So the notion of wise reasoning, so it's necessary for solving this kind of ill-defined complex situations where there is no clear-cut solution, is based on the idea that what can really help you is to think through the complexities and perspectives of different stakeholders, recognize that maybe you don't know everything about the situation at hand. Quite often, especially if it's a complex situation, we don't possess all the information, and our spontaneous tendency very often is to focus on ourselves and like say me, like and you, because you bring in already some certain perspective. But to go beyond that perspective, to recognize your humility, intellectually speaking, just like that, you don't know everything, to consider the perspectives of other people, to consider how the situation may unfold, and that there are multiple ways the situation may unfold, and to try to reconcile these different perspectives, yours, others, to balance it out, realizing that it may not lead to a benefit of a single person, but will be somewhere in the middle. Those are the key features of sort of wise reasoning, have been featured in various philosophical traditions from East Asia, from South Asia, as well as in the Western philosophical canon.
Absolutely. And, your work on intelligence versus wise reasoning, the study that you'd done with Justin Brienza, could you walk through the study setup with folks and some of the key findings that you uncovered?
So the work on wise reasoning and intelligence started actually even before that, Mark. It started when I first started looking at the relationship to well-being and happiness. So like how satisfied are people with their lives? Because the idea there was that, intelligent people are not necessarily happier. In fact, there are at least as many who are miserable. So intelligence does make you happy, but supposedly good judgment and be able to make good decisions is supposed to make you happy. So what's going on there? And so that's why I started looking at the wise reasoning features. So that was the first step, sort of like try to differentiate and contrast wise reasoning and IQ, the way how intelligence normally measured, with respect to this critical feature, subjective well-being, interpersonal relations. So I studied that for quite a while. With Justin Brienza, who's one of the terrific students of mine who recently graduated, we look specifically at the relationship of wise reasoning and intelligence to some extent across a different strata in the population, among people who have high education versus don't have high education, as well as among people from different regions in the United States, more affluent regions and less affluent regions. And essentially, we had a set of studies. In one study, for instance, we asked people to think about the most recent conflict they had with somebody and work through the experience and reconstruct this experience, recall the details of this experience, and afterwards asked people to reflect on it and looked at the qualities of their reflection. So do they recognize that they need more information? Do they consider taking perspectives of other people? Are they willing to compromise? So those features of what I described as wise reasoning. And it turns out that there were some interesting regional differences and individual differences, and they were going in different direction than you would expect from the classic intelligence research.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely something that I don't think people intuitively would think, that the higher your social class, the less likely you are to reason wisely.
Right. Yeah, so those were some of the findings, and we find that both, it's not a huge effect, and I want to emphasize that it's also a local effect. What that means is that, and that's, by the way, is revealing to some extent why that may be happening. So we can just speculate, but the reason it may be happening is that if you live in the environment in which a lot of things are uncertain and in which you need to some extent cooperate with others because you will not be able to manage things on your own, then you start developing this reasoning strategies of perspective taking, of recognizing limits of yourself and recognizing the uncertainty there is in the world. More as compared to if you live in an environment in which everything is prepared, you live in your single detached somewhere in the suburbs, you have one or two cars, the college for kids is paid off, and you can just plan for the future. And there is of course always uncertainty, but it's much less than you. And what you educate your kids to do also is very different. Instead of focusing on maybe other people, you teach them that they are the best, that they will be the next leaders, the next president of the United States if you want. And sort of the mantra that you have for education also in the middle class America and Canada to some extent is very different. What we teach our kids than what maybe blue-collar parents teach their kids, if they have time to teach their kids in the first place. And bottom line is that if you live in this kind of more uncertain, ecologically uncertain environment that is associated with people from less educated, lower income strata, then that by itself forces you to both cooperate with others and to think about different, maybe undesirable alternatives about the future. And those processes force you to develop this wise reasoning. Now, the issue here, and that's why it's important, and I would like to emphasize that,
for sure,
is that it's local, it's specific to the interpersonal domain, and you can still have absolutely no difference, or it may go a completely different direction. Let's say if you think about it, the group questions or political decision making or something else. So what I'm emphasizing, it's specific to the reasoning about the interpersonal issues in their own lives.
And from an evolutionary perspective, Igor, I mean, that seems to make sense in terms of this idea of being in an environment where the future is uncertain, where you might be working multiple jobs to pay the bills, you might not be getting as much sleep as you'd like, you're shuffling the kids off to school and to other events through friends or nannies or whomever else. There needs to be some sort of teamwork involved here. And you don't have the, as you mentioned, you don't have the luxury of really planning for the future. Is this, from an evolutionary standpoint, if environments are more, I don't know what the right term is, threatening, or there's more stress in them, is that a natural or an evolutionary reaction to have that sort of effect, would you say?
It's possible. I mean, as often with evolutionary ideas, we can only speculate about some of them. You need to consider it in a much longer term perspective. But what we know from prior studies of evolution as well as ecology is that human minds are incredibly adaptive. Depending on the situation, we can really develop different strategies from very early on, how to make sense, how to effectively live in that situation. It doesn't take many generations to do that for humans. So from this perspective, this kind of adaptation of what processes to focus on. So for instance, why would it make sense for a person in a low-income environment where there's so much uncertainty to do well on so-called self-regulation tasks? So one common finding is that kids from low-income environments in North America, instead of waiting for 2 cookies, they will want to rather take 1 cookie now. And so it's like, you can either have 1 cookie now, or you can wait a little bit and then you can get 2 cookies later. And they're taking 1 cookie. And that's a test of self-regulation, or marshmallow, or whatever you want to call it.
Yep.
That marshmallow test. Instead of 1 marshmallow, now you can have 2 marshmallows later. So why is that happening? Well, if you live in the environment in which everything is highly uncertain, then you don't know if you'll get those 2 cookies later. And so you better live it now, live it to the fullest. Planning for the future is futile because realistically, and in fact, to some extent, certainly in the U.S., that's not as much the case in Canada, and definitely not in Europe, but in the U.S. that is true, that they are objectively right not to plan for the future because the society doesn't provide them with resources necessary to really grow and maybe get a better job and maybe get higher education. How can they if the tuition fees are so high? So bottom line is, from that perspective, some of those processes that are considered to be maladaptive, so they are not regulating themselves that well, apparently, could be also construed as evolutionary adaptive. They just do what you would do in an uncertain environment, similar to how many other animals would do it. So it's for other animals, we also know that when the ecology is uncertain and high risk, they choose different strategies than if the ecology is relaxed and you don't have to worry about the predator, or you don't have to worry about the scarcity of resources.
Yeah, it's fascinating in that from a medical side as well, we see in lower income areas, worse health compared to higher income areas. And one of the classic examples is in London in the UK. You can sort of go from one side of the city to the other, and I think the average life expectancy jumps by about a decade. And the notion around trying to convey dietary practices or reduction of alcohol or reduction of smoking, and oftentimes docs will wonder, why can't my client or patient just do this thing? This is the right solution, and yet they choose not to do it. And that notion around, as you mentioned, sort of just thinking in the short term of, geez, it's been a hard week. I just want to have unfortunately have a beer or 2 beers or whatever it might be. And they're really, so we don't seem to be tackling the root of the problem if we're avoiding this whole idea of environment and safety, would you say?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I mean, what I would like to emphasize is that, this idea of that in some aspects they may actually be more adapt to this type of environment, to the uncertainty, than middle class or people who have high education, who are well off, is that this type of reasoning is actually maybe potentially more beneficial for thinking through problems instead of constantly thinking about the limitations and weaknesses. So we can capitalize on this environment. We can potentially think about in this environment they can really do this better. So maybe we can frame this message about how to reduce alcohol, not in terms of long-term benefits, but maybe in terms of interpersonal benefits. Or maybe we can how about focusing on the actual root of a problem? So there are no jobs and there is no support for these people. There are structural problems that may need to be addressed instead of saying, hey, it's just because you suck because your self-regulation is so bad, or you suck because you just can't control yourself. You just should be learning to control yourself better. So instead of internalizing it, sometimes it is about structural forces. And we see that in those countries in Europe, like in Scandinavia, where there is more structural support, people of a low-income background do much, much better. And their health is not as much impacted as in the UK or in North America.
Yeah, and another aspect to this story as well, which you touch on in your work, is the idea of, in this interpersonal conflict, if one of the individuals believes themselves or is of a higher social class than the other, then that actually impacts their ability to be reasoning wisely within that framework. That seems to, even on that medical example, seems to impact, again, how well the clinician or doc would put themselves in the shoes of the patient rather than just sort of giving the advice that is, quote unquote, the best advice to give. Can you comment around that?
Yeah. Well, yes. I mean, I'm not sure I could directly speak to the medical situation. That's something that we haven't tested yet. So, I mean, I would be a bit hesitant to generalize here. But the idea is that if you think you have a conflict with somebody whom you perceive to have much more power or higher status than you, then you, by default, would probably be a bit more vigilant, a bit more careful, and you would feel the uncertainty a bit more than if you are in a role where you are the supervisor or where you are somebody who is in charge of other people. So you don't have to have that level of vigilance. I mean, which is ironic. Because, I mean, after all, if you're in a sort of leadership position or you're in charge of other people, you have a greater power. So, for instance, you're a doctor and you're talking to a patient. Of course, that's where wisdom is needed most. Mm-hmm. And yet, in those situations, it seems to be that people are kind of blind to the contextual information. They just tend to shut it slightly off and focus mostly on their own perspective.
It's funny because I actually saw a study coming out around AI and how the ability of AI to be able to diagnose a lot of things meant that potentially in the near future, a lot of medical schools will be shifting all the focus to bedside manner with the patient because AI will be able to diagnose things so accurately. But anyway, time will tell on that side of things. But if we shift gears here a little bit, right, Igor, and talk about today's world of, today's social media world, we see individualism on the rise, which typically translates to things like greater self-reliance, but also, as you note, it also tends to lead to greater narcissism. And so, around this wise reasoning, we have people obviously on, Instagram or taking photos of themselves, posting, this generation obviously very different from generations past in that sense. So when we look at, intelligence is on the rise, which is terrific, but how can we not sacrifice this ability to communicate effectively and to reason wisely amongst groups?
That's a very good question. And if I knew the answer to that question, I would probably not be on the podcast. But no, but jokes aside, I think the issues here are structural, and it is very scary. I mean, because the world we live in today, we do glorify this hyper-individualism. Just think about the influencers on social media. I yet have to find an influencer who is influencing because of their hyper-social, self-sacrificial nature. Most of them are the epitomes of this kind of narcissism and individualism, one way or another. They're incredibly unique individuals. That's the whole point of being an influencer, I guess. Mm-hmm. And we have quite a bit of that, and we glorify that. And as long as we continue glorifying those features instead of, I mean, it's weird because when you think about it, would you want to glorify somebody who's really balanced and moderate and who is not really emphasizing that they're really good? It's sort of like think about it. It's almost like the opposite of one of those quotes by the current U.S. president, where he was once asked, I think last year, 2 years ago, or maybe it was before the election, if he is humble, and he just said that I'm the most humble person. You have no idea how you can't even comprehend how humble I am. And they're just like, really? Okay. So
it's a tough one.
Right. So if somebody then does act, and if you want to emphasize humility, especially interpersonal humility, not jumping to conclusions immediately, reaching across the currently topic of great interest, political aisles, those people are not striking one as sort of most exciting. And we live in a time of sort of attention economy where it's all about excitement. It's about grabbing somebody's attention for a few seconds. So I don't quite know what to do about this. I do think that just a general shift in the dialogue from dialogue that emphasizes excellence and remarkable abilities in something that is like singular, either be it intelligence or be it a particular type of sports or something else, towards a more sort of holistic picture where you would think about, not how wonderful you were because you did X, but instead of that, about like a balance of multiple factors. Maybe one way to go about this. The other thing is just to have a more healthy discourse, either through podcasts like this one or other means, where we would not just write about influencers and President Trump or whatnot, who are clearly remarkable and unique in their own ways, for better or for worse. But also talk about stories of people who did potentially make sacrifices for the benefit of others, and talk about those who did show some uncertainty and doubt in their life. Well, one big issue that we have today, in addition to this hyper individualism that goes hand in hand, by the way, is this unwillingness to admit mistakes and to show uncertainty. If you think about medical professionals in particular, it's almost dangerous, right? Like, I think about what doctor would want to say, well, actually, I don't know what you have. I mean, just think about it. It's like I yet have to meet a doc whom I will come to, and they will tell me, I don't know what you have. And in many cases, it is a guess, especially if it's a complex disorder, right?
Yeah, chronic conditions are all complex, right? It's obviously the best guess of the practitioner, their experience, and for sure.
Yeah, but admit to yourself that this is just a guess, and I really need more information. Those are only the best doctors do that, and only for maybe very threatening diseases. So bottom line is, so this type of idea of recognizing your humility and counteracting the ever-increasing pressure to be hyper-confident and very, very unique. Because if you're not unique, then you're not interesting. Those are the processes that we somehow have to combat. And I think just a general societal discourse on this topic has to shift. But I don't have a clear-cut solution to how exactly to do that.
Oh, I mean, that's very well said. And, I'd love to get your thoughts on the performance side of things as well. I often hear from, in elite and professional sport from performance staffs that the young crop of sports scientists coming out are, incredibly intelligent and able to do things at a younger age than they were never able to do. But one of the shortcomings is this ability to sort of communicate their findings effectively, to sort of integrate with the teams and or with the hierarchies in terms of relaying the messages to whether it's the lead sports scientist or the manager of the squad of the team. And again, that sort of strikes me as this, whether it's a conflict or not, I guess this is another question, but around relaying information to someone who's of a quote unquote higher social class and how you do that, or if you have any thoughts around that inability to be able to I guess really dig very deep with their analysis, but not be able to improve in terms of their breadth or their ability to communicate that information.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question. How do you nurture this type of consideration of others' perspectives, the ability to integrate and cooperate with them? I mean, I guess in the sport context where it is hyper personal, where it's about, your income to some extent. Maybe one way to think about it is if you can emphasize that it's not me versus them, but rather it's a sort of a group project. I mean, it seems so obvious what I'm saying, but it's so easy, especially in the sport competitive context where it is ultimately me versus them, but it's just accept that it's on the group level, right? Like you constantly compete with somebody else, either with another sport team and so on and so forth, or if it's individual sport, obviously you compete with others. So there the focus is always on, it's zero sum in a sense. Like that's a term from economics, from game theory, that means that you view it as somebody will lose, somebody has to lose, and somebody will win. And I think that is, of course, the case when you have teams competing against each other. However, within a team, the process doesn't have to replicate. And in fact, it's to emphasize that you will have a greater chance of winning if it is about group performance. So maybe not even focus on winning, but just really focus on having a group coherence. So the goal is not just about winning, not just about showing how good you are, but it's about having fun within your group. Maybe that's something that can help. I mean, of course, it's hard to say that when there's a lot of money involved. And the money is individual in this case. But I guess emphasizing that your group will perform even better if you focus on the group instead of if you focus on the individual and make people aware of the difference between their group performance on the one hand and some kind of like so that the competition happens on the level of the group, but not doesn't have to happen in the same way within the group. In fact, it's detrimental. That could help. I think ultimately it's also about just paying attention to others and maybe putting people who are in the other strategy, people who are more advanced, more mature, in a mentorship position. So like as mentors potentially of younger players on the same team. And I think that happens quite often. I mean, either explicitly or indirectly, where that by itself could develop a sort of awareness of the degree of dependence between the two group members. And under many circumstances, this dependence can be healthy because it may help you to realize their perspectives and their concerns instead of just your concerns.
Yeah, it's amazing how it tends to be something that sort of happens somewhat organically on the teams that become these sort of great teams. As you mentioned, having sort of mentors or players taking other players under their wings, and these organizations that seem to be able to thrive in this we first and team culture, and everyone else trying to figure out how to find that magical solution. But if we look at an individual level, the rest of us trying to sort out conflicts at work and with our family and friends and whatnot, how can we increase our ability to reason wisely? Are there any general recommendations to foster better wise reasoning?
Well, it's probably too early to tell that. The one strategy that we found to be effective under some circumstances, and I really should emphasize that it's fairly early on because we haven't tested its application in the real world, just in the context of strict laboratory or experimental conditions outside of the laboratory, but it has been expanded to all sorts of conflicts. Anyways, this caveat aside, the strategy that seemed to be working the best so far is if you have a conflict with somebody, try to take a step back and review it from sort of LeBron James perspective, where you start talking from a third person about yourself.
Nice.
So that does help a little bit. It's a small increment, but if you want to try this for a week. Just at the end of the day, write yourself a little diary in the third person and see what does it do to you after a few days. If you continue, and it doesn't have to be just about the bad stuff. It can be just, what's the most interesting thing that happened to me today? And interesting can be interesting bad, but could also be interesting good. And most of the time, our life is actually pretty good. Oh, just okay. And so write about that from a third person perspective. So, and that does have some positive effects. I mean, they are small and incremental, which means you often don't even see them. As often, we don't see how we change ourselves, but there are some shifts. For instance, we've done this over a course of a month, and when people do it over a course of a month, you compare their wise reasoning before to after, and there are quite substantial shifts. So that's one key strategy that we have identified to be fairly robust. Another strategy is, we already mentioned that, is to develop this type of teams of mentor-mentees that can foster some degree of interdependence in the relationship and promote, to some extent, less selfishness. Selfishness is the key factor for inhibiting factor for wise reasoning. And so if you can find ways to reduce the selfishness, and by that I do not mean just being egocentric in terms of your goals, but also just a cognitive perspective with which you approach the world. So quite often we can be very much interested in helping others, but our initial perspective is always, well, first person perspective. We start with me and then the rest of the world. And quite often that can be detrimental for your reasoning, because you never really get to seeing the other parts of the world. You just get stuck with me when you start generating arguments from that perspective. So switching that, maybe sometimes try to take the other perspectives into account first before you start considering your own, maybe another strategy. But this later ones are more speculative right now. Where we do have clearest evidence is this kind of writing in the third person about yourself.
That's terrific. It's great to have some suggestions there of evidence-based strategies. And as you mentioned, it's interesting to see how consistency, whether we talk training, nutrition, that doing this as a regular practice really starts to develop those skills. And Igor, if we sort of zoom back out to 30,000 feet here, and you mentioned at the start how wise reasoning is more helpful in these complex situations where problems, the solutions aren't so obvious. And, in medicine and training, if you're a physio, nutrition, even all these things, there's no one clear answer. There's lots of, different ways of doing it. And the outcomes are mixed between between clients and people. Some people have tremendous results. Other people, we need to continue to problem solve. So could you talk a bit more again and round off this discussion around the value of the wise reasoning in these solving complex problems?
Well, one of the key values of wise reasoning is that it allows you to go beyond finding a single algorithmic solution to an issue. Quite often, we don't have those type of the type of situations we encounter in everyday life don't lead themselves to have a one clear-cut solution. Quite often, we just don't know all the parameters that may be involved, all the perspectives of other people, or in the medical or sort of performance context, all the features of an individual that may be relevant for making them perform better. And what wise reasoning does is it helps you to go beyond just thinking about one solution to a perspective where you try to integrate multiple considerations, be it, what is best for the individual, what is best for the group, or what is best for a husband, what is best for a wife, what is best for my own performance, and what is best for my group's performance. And in that sense, it goes beyond just something where the algorithm would say just me, or group. Wise reasoning would try to find some kind of a balance in between those. And in the way it does it, it helps you to pay more attention to the situation at hand, something that we often are having sort of a blind spot for. We don't really see the situation as much as we should, because if you put too much attention to every single situation in our lives, we would not be able to function normally. But we are misers. We often just try to find the best heuristic solution. And what wise reasoning does, it's an antidote to that. It forces you to slow down and deliberately think through, well, maybe there are some features of the situation that are worth considering instead of just taking some rules of thumb. And that, in a way, can be beneficial for the larger group and for the person, but you may not even see it immediately.
Igor, that's tremendous. Fantastic insights here. And before we wrap up, I want to respect your time. What do you think the evolution of the research is in this area then in the next sort of 5 or 10 years?
Well, I think we're in a very exciting period where we just started looking at this type of questions of what is wisdom and how can we measure it. For thousands of years, we talked about the concept. In every serious society that you can think of that survived for more than 100 years had some ideas about what wisdom is. But only in the last 10, 15 years, we started to measure it for real in psychology, where we have now some instruments that can help us identify individual differences, help us to identify how can we improve it in everyday life, as we just talked about. And so I think in the next 5 to 10 years, we'll be working on this trajectory, and who knows what will bring. It will be very foolish of me to present you with one perspective on how this research will unfold. But I do think that we'll probably have a greater focus on identifying different situations under which wisdom may be adaptive, and maybe, hopefully, we can convince the more general population instead of just a small group of scientists, that focusing on this qualities instead of just on IQ, instead of just on some uniqueness features, can be beneficial for the society at large, and that we can all need and we can all use some wisdom in our lives.
Amen, 100% there. I think I could use a little more as well. And Igor, I definitely appreciate you taking the time today. Where can people keep up with all your tremendous research and keep up with what you're up to?
So you can definitely follow me on Twitter. I am Sci Wisdom. The toggle Sci Wisdom that's me. PSI and wisdom as one word. And otherwise, they can just look up my lab website at the University of Waterloo, Wisdom and Culture Lab. If you Google that, you will find more about our work and our publications. And finally, me and actually a colleague from London, UK, have a podcast which is called onwisdompodcast.com. On Wisdom Podcast as one word, where we also try to digest some of these complex matters for general audience.